Asks Why. I'm Avi Cooper, and I'm joined by, as always, by Hannah Abrams and Tony Brew. Two friends, two colleagues. I feel like y'all are family now, but how's it going?
I'm doing great.
On that note,
I'm excited. Yeah. Now that I'm your family member, let's learn.
Honorary family member. No, no. This is going to be a cool episode, and we've called it Tusks and Tumor Suppressors. And we're going to be discussing a comparative biology topic. It's going to take us all the way from very large animals to very tiny chromosomes. Hannah's going to walk us through this fascinating question: why don't elephants get cancer? So, Hannah, I feel like you come up with amazing, insightful, like crazy questions that, like, just I don't know how your brain works. It's so cool. How did you come up with this incredible question?
Wow. On that note, I have to acknowledge, so two disclaimers. The first is it wasn't my question. I went to an oncology grand rounds by this scientist, Ira Millman, who is a cell biologist. He invented discovered endosomes. And during his talk, he brought up this question. It was about kind of like broadly cancer biology. And he said, like, yes, everyone knows, of course, the fascinating question of why elephants don't get cancer. And then started talking about it. And I was like, I have never heard of this. I have to look this up. Like, I have to learn more. The second disclaimer is that elephants do actually get cancer. They just don't get cancer. I know. Episode over. They just don't
we
get
fooled you. We fooled you.
Yeah, you clicked on the link. They do get cancer, but they get cancer at a much lower rate than we would expect. And so I thought it was such an interesting question. It kind of takes us through a lot of cancer biology. And I'm excited to tell you guys about it. Had either of you guys heard of this before? This idea that elephants might not get cancer?
This is something I've heard about, and I had it on my list of topics to look up and learn about, and I just hadn't had the opportunity to do that. So I couldn't be more pleased that you've done the work for us and will provide an answer that I haven't previously found myself.
Yeah, I've never heard of this. I'm going to be learning a lot tonight, for sure.
Yeah, I am excited to share it with you guys. So maybe we'll start with the first question is to say, do elephants get cancer? What is the epidemiology of elephant cancer? Elephant oncology?
You don't have an elephant cancer clinic, I imagine.
I don't. I'll have to pitch that one. A new faculty niche. And again, elephants do get cancer. It's just at a lower rate than we might expect. So in general, we're kind of spoiled here in human medicine because we have these large cancer databases. And I kind of take it for granted that we know how frequent cancer is as a disease because we have these databases of diseases and cancer registries. But that is not really existent on the savannah, for example. And so most of our estimates of this come from databases and large autopsy studies of zoo animals. And in humans, cancer mortality rate on sort of a similar type of study can be between 10 and 25%, which is similar range for most mammals, between 10 and 20%. And in elephants, the cancer mortality rate is 4.8%. So it's not zero, but it's definitely not something to turn one's trunk up at.
And that's lifetime risk of dying of cancer?
That is incidence of cancer on autopsy. Great question.
I met 3 elephants this past week. My kids had school vacation week, so we went to the Roger Williams Zoo in Rhode Island and met 3 elephants who'd been living together for like 40 years. And so, like, elephants live a long time, or can, and they're obviously quite large creatures. And so this seems like a little bit of a paradox because you can imagine a large creature like an elephant would have an enormous number of cells, and all those cells would increase the probability that any individual cell would transform and become cancerous, thereby predisposing the entire elephant to cancer. So like this, that doesn't seem to be happening. So like what's going on?
Exactly. Yes. I recently had an attending refer to this as tickets to the cancer lottery. So the idea is that cell size is about conserved between most species. So elephants have a lot more cells. They have a lot more tickets to the cancer lottery, a lot more opportunities for one of those to accumulate oncogenic mutations and develop a cancer. So statistically, just like you're saying, Tony, they should develop more cancer, not less.
Right.
And they live for a long time. So that's a lot of years. It's a lot of shots. And so this is called Peto's paradox, and it is named after an epidemiologist in the UK, Richard Peto, who in the 1970s studied mice. And he noticed that despite the fact that humans have a lot more cells than mice and live for a lot longer, sort of a similar thing, about 30 times longer, the two species actually don't have very different cancer incidence. And he was studying carcinogenesis in mice. And he named the paper Cancer and Aging in Mice and Men, about describing, it's a great title.
Very literary.
Yeah, describing this paradox of why don't bigger creatures who live longer develop more cancer?
Okay, so we've got this Peto's paradox. Is there something evolutionarily that sort of allows an animal to get bigger, but also keeping cancer incidence from sort of, skyrocketing and going through the roof? Because presumably that would have been sorted out over the course of natural selection, that if you add all these, add more cells to a bigger body and your cancer incidence spikes, you'd think that would be sort of, maladaptive. So is there something evolutionarily going on?
There is. And so here we get to the crux of the episode. So, and I'll say first that elephants are a commonly used example, but the paradox is the same for other types of animals too, and we'll talk about some of them later. But the answer comes back to basically the fundamentals of how cancer develops and brings us to a particularly well-known gene, which is called TP53. So let's start with maybe what do you guys remember about TP53 or the protein P53? Because in the oncology universe, I feel like I spent a lot of time talking about it.
So just to clarify, T53 is the gene, P53 is the protein product of that gene?
Yes, correct.
Okay. So T53 is like a tumor suppressor gene, right? So the protein that it makes the P53 is a tumor suppressing protein.
Yeah.
And this is like kind of crazy to say, but I can remember from either elementary school or early middle school some New York Times article about P53, and I cut it out, and I said, I don't know, internally, oh, this is fascinating. I want to go into biology and medicine because of P53.
Whoa.
So
that's why you're sitting here.
Yeah. I didn't become an oncologist, but it was just so profound, the idea that there was this particular gene protein that had such control over whether or not someone ended up getting cancer. And I just found it fascinating even then.
Yeah.
I was a little bit of a nerd.
That it is the guardian of the genome. It is the determiner of your fate, cell fate also. So it's a really remarkable protein. And one of the things that I think is so interesting about it is that it takes us back to the very basics, what we call the hallmarks of cancer, in a way that applies to a lot of people with cancer. So the hallmarks of cancer are these fundamental properties of cancer that have been described as sort of a way to categorize all of the different things that cancer can do. And two of those fundamental properties or enabling factors for cancer, one is called genomic instability, meaning an increase in frequency of new mutations. And the other is the ability to evade apoptosis or programmed cell death. And many cancer predisposition syndromes are really fundamentally diseases of DNA damage repair gone wrong, in which, for whatever reason, there is evasion of these normal regulatory mechanisms on repairing DNA damage, or there's damage to those mechanisms themselves. Mutations can accumulate, and then those lead to the ability to proliferate out of control, aka cancer. So that genomic instability, that fundamental hallmark of cancer, for many people starts for many cancers, starts or is catalyzed by a problem with P53. It is a 53 kilodalton protein, hence the name, which basically acts as the linchpin of our cellular response, our response to cellular stress and DNA damage. As I was telling Tony, it is If you put P53 into PubMed, there are over 100,000 articles on it. It is probably one of the most famous and studied proteins in all of biology. And so I'm just going to very briefly summarize and acknowledge that we're going to miss a lot of things about P53.
You're summarizing 100,000 articles right now. Good luck.
Yeah, I think like 1,200. It was 112,000 when I looked yesterday. Honestly, by the time this episode comes out, it may hit 20,000.
There's going to be more. Yeah.
Yeah. So, in a normal state, very briefly, in a normal state, there's a small amount of this P53 protein that sits around in our cells. And it mostly is, so it's regulated by multiple proteins, but by one protein most commonly called MDM2. And so, in a regular state, P53 is not doing very much because it's bound to or interacted with this MDM2. When there's a cellular stress, so hypoxia, DNA damage, a pH change, variety of things, those things can decrease in a variety of ways the amount of interaction between P53 and MDM2, which allows that P53 to spring into action and activate a bunch of genes, which can pause the cell cycle to prevent replication or can just induce apoptosis.
Okay, so that all seems pretty important, that P53 be able to do that. So what's gone wrong in cancer cells that P53 is not doing?
And we're talking about sort of the vast spectrum of cancer. So a variety of things can happen to TP53 or P53, the protein. So the gene can get mutated, it can get inactivated by a virus, it can get hypermethylated, so epigenetically downregulated, or even it can get inactivated because there's too much MDM2 or too much of one of these other inhibitors around. And when any of those things happen, we lose or decrease our ability to stop cells with DNA damage from replicating. So those cells can start to replicate out of control. They can start to pick up other mutations that lead to immortality, faster replication. That makes up cancer. And this is super common. So this is the most commonly mutated gene in all of oncology, and it is present in 39% of cancers in a very large databank study.
That's crazy. 39%. Wow.
Also just an amazing study to do.
Yeah.
So super common, and it's not always the first hit, but it is often a hit or a catalyst. And so TP53, because of that, is, Avi, like you mentioned, part of this category called tumor suppressor genes, which is a gene that encodes a protein at baseline that is helping protect against cancer. That's compared to proto-oncogenes, which is a gene that, when mutated, can become a cancer-promoting gene, like a protein called like BCR-ABL, HER2, EGFR are sort of probably our most famous ones.
It's like a car without a brake, right?
Yeah, exactly. That is like a TP53 mutation versus a BCR-ABL is maybe throwing a wrench into something.
Or it's like
it's
the accelerator.
It's the accelerator, yeah,
that you can't let off.
Exactly, yeah. And I will say, so some newer studies in that 100,000 studies have shown that there is some gain of function that can happen in some TP53 mutations, but we tend to think predominantly of it as a tumor suppressor. And I think the kind of classic example of that is what's called Fraumeni syndrome, which is a germline loss of one copy of the TP53 gene. So usually you have two copies, you've lost one copy. And that's a cancer predisposition syndrome if you've lost one copy of your TP53 that is associated with an 80% risk of cancer by the age of 70. So pretty high penetrance. If you don't have as much TP53 around, you have a much higher likelihood of developing cancer.
So I think the way you've described it, you've made a strong case that this protein, this P53, has earned its reputation as sort of the guardian protein, and then TP53 as like the gene, as the guardian of the genome. And sort of like at baseline, it keeps us sort of things under control by pausing the cell cycle or promoting apoptosis if there's actual DNA damage. And when there's not enough of this protein around, the brakes are off. Things rapidly sort of continue to progress without that break, and kind of things get out of control. Cancer in way too many people who have a mutation.
I'd say,
This
should we?
sounds bad.
Or say, should we say it stampedes out of control? Sort of bringing it back to the elephant question, the elephant in the room. Is why?
Yeah, where is that elephant?
Yeah.
not here. I don't know.
Yeah.
No, but back to this question of why do elephants have seems like much lower cancer rates than we do, and avoid this they sort of stay within the Peto paradox with these big huge bodies, lots of cells. They get even less cancer than we do. So how can we relate that?
Yeah, let's bring it back to the herd. So the simplest answer, and if I were going to just answer even with one word, the baseline question of the episode, it's more P53. So, but I think the answer actually tells us a lot more about how elephants have evolved and about cancer suppression itself. So, two simultaneous scientific groups in 2015 and 2016 broke this story, sort of working, it appears, around the same time. And they each sequenced the genomes of African and Asian elephants. Both groups found that most elephants, and specifically African elephants have the highest rate, have about 20 copies of TP53 or homologous genes. And in particular, what it really looks like is that the African elephants have one copy of a TP53 that looks like our TP53, what they call the ancestral mammalian copy, and about 19 copies of a retrogene version of TP53. So a retrogene is when mRNA that's floating around undergoes reverse transcription and gets reincorporated back into the genome. So you can essentially develop extra copies which may or may not be functional. And in this case, they appear to be functional based on everything we're seeing so far. And so one of the two groups showed that if you expose elephant lymphocytes to ionizing radiations, which should be carcinogenic, right, the cells will undergo apoptosis at a significantly higher rate than healthy human controls, and which is also about double the rate of individuals who have Fraumeni syndrome. So there is a higher rate of apoptosis when exposed to stress. And that kind of brings up the question, well, is it that the retrogene, these different isoforms of P53, are interacting, are working the same way as P53? Or is it that they're doing something else? And the science is still working on this. There's a couple of papers on this. There's not so many scientific groups that can work on elephant DNA because samples are limited. But it looks like probably what happens is that the isoform interacts differently with the regulator, MDM2, which either helps block the inhibition of that one ancestral copy or those ancestral ones, or is having some transcriptional effect itself. Either way, the end result is that there's a lot more P53 around, and the elephant cells are much more exquisitely sensitive to DNA damage, which should be carcinogenic.
So in terms of the interaction question with MDM2, would it be acting like a decoy there, basically, to sort of like occupy the regulator to allow the ancestral P53 copy to sort of just be more active than it normally would?
Yeah, and I think that in 10 years it seems like we're going to have a better answer to this question, because it looks right now like the different groups sort of have different assessments. And just the same way as P53 does a whole lot of stuff, probably there are multiple aspects of it. Probably there's some component of transcription, and this is just my speculation, some component of transcriptional activity, and then some component that's the decoy for the MDM2, or stabilizing it in other ways.
So fascinating. So it sounds like, elephants have 20 times the amount of P53 that we do. And as a result, they, in response to DNA damage, more sort of reliably hit the kill sequence, right? And go to apoptosis instead of having that damaged cell persist and potentially become a cancer. They do that extra P53 increases the amount of apoptosis that happens, which is prevents cancer preventative. So it seems like they've got it figured out. Like, why can't we all do that?
Yes. Shouldn't we just be elephants? And I think one of the things that's so interesting to me is that this seems, I almost thought about naming this episode, How Come Elephants Can Get So Big? Not even why don't elephants get cancer, or why don't they get as much cancer as we might expect them to? But does this actually explain something fundamental about elephants themselves and giant mammals themselves? And so one of the two groups, the 2016 group, Sulak et al., they generated this super impressive phylogeny of how these mutations, how the retrogene copy number increased over time through this massive phylogeny. And they inferred that probably the first retrogene transposition happened about 64 million years ago. And then about 40 million years ago, the copy number started to increase. And they noticed that that coincides with an increase in size of elephant precursors, elephant ancestors. And so they hypothesized that that might have been one of the factors that allowed proboscideans, this category that I learned about while looking up this episode, to grow so big, to make elephants so big today.
One of the things I learned when I visited the zoo last week was that African elephants are bigger than Asian elephants. And so that fits with what you said, I think, a moment ago, which is that African elephants have more copies of P53 or TP53 than do Asian elephants. And if they're bigger, that kind of all tracks together. The larger the mammal, potentially the more copies of TP53 that they harbor. That make sense?
Yeah, it totally does. And we'll link in the show notes to the paper, because it's really cool to look at. I believe that it is free, open access, but they kind of go through other groups in this natural group and discuss how many copies of the retrogene that they have.
So I think Avi already asked this question, and I'll ask it again. So why haven't more species done this? And then, sort of putting on my bioethicist hat for just a moment, why shouldn't we do this? Meaning, not the three of us, but humans more generally. Like, should we be CRISPRing TP53 into the genome of humans to prevent cancers? Because it seems like that seems kind of doable.
In the era of gene editing. So maybe I'll tackle, I think the first question is, why don't more species do this? And then the second question is, why don't humans do this? Yeah. So there's other animals, but there's one particular type of big animal that has done something similar. And I wanted to see if you guys can guess it.
So
it's more complex. Yeah.
I've heard that marine mammals, specifically like whales, like the blue whale, and even sharks, have a low propensity for cancer, but I'm not sure if that's what you're thinking about. I'm not sure if you've heard of any other animals.
Well, I guess, is it a contemporary animal?
Because it is.
Okay,
great question.
So Brontosaurus, right? That's a good thought.
I so want to know about Brontosaurus P53. Oh wait, Brontosauruses are not real, right?
Yeah. There's like, ask my son.
Or giraffes? I don't know. I'm trying to think of other.
Oh, that's a good one.
No.
Yeah.
Oh, now I have so many other animals to look up. And I really want to know about dinosaurs, but unfortunately, it seems like there's probably not the tissue specimens out there for us to do this. No. Maybe someday. And I'll let the audience know that I have meticulously hidden from Tony and Avi the answer to this question, which is the humpback whale. So they don't get enough credit in this discussion. The elephants got all the glory because the group doing the elephants published a couple years earlier. But whales have about 1,000 times more cells than humans. Some species can live up to 200 years, so they clearly are in on this game. They have to be avoiding cancer somehow. Yeah. And the brief answer is that whales do have significant numbers of replications in cell cycle regulators and tumor suppressors that do appear to have evolved over time as they became larger, but it's not quite as simple and straightforward as the P53 story.
That's so interesting. Well, go ahead, Tony.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, nonetheless, tumor suppression, whether you're a humpback whale, an African elephant, or some other creature, seems like a good thing. But
it seems necessary. It seems necessary to be really, really large.
Which is why we need to see the sort of Allosaurus or whatever, name your famous or most favorite large dinosaur. They are probably teeming with these genes. If not for that meteorite, we would know more.
Exactly. Exactly.
Well, I thought that's why I thought you were going to say something, because you said the first thing was 64 million years ago, the first
It's true.
mutation. I was like,
I had seen
interesting,
a couple of people speculating on it, but I'm not sure if there was anything. I'll look more.
well,
But
the whole, I feel like we should do like an episode. We should do an episode on like whale evolution, because it's so fascinating. They like they reverse evolved like aquatic,
yeah.
like fish-like characteristics from land. Like, so I don't know. This just makes me think. I know whales are cool, but now they're really cool.
Avi, I gotta tell you that the paper that I have linked to in the show notes about this in whales is called "Return to the Sea, Get Huge, Beat Cancer: An Analysis of Cetacean Genomes, including an assembly for the humpback whale."
Oh,
but that's the thing, is I think it's not
beautiful.
just the whale; it's other cetaceans, other marine mammals who have a similar propensity to avoid cancer, given even despite their large size.
Yeah, I think as genomics and comparative genomics becomes a burgeoning and much more accessible and doable field, we're going to continue to learn so much from all of these different comparative pieces. Yes, I am reminded in particular, yes, that recently I learned that trabectedin, which is a sarcoma drug, comes from sea squirts. Anyway, so there is much to be learned from comparative biology, I think. But Tony, to come back to your question, why not finish learning right here and just insert a bunch of TP53 retro genes? Unfortunately, there is no free lunch. So in mouse models where they just knock in a bunch of TP53, there is a significantly lower fertility rate, less cell proliferation, and smaller organ size, including smaller kidneys.
Okay, so if you're gonna make my kidneys smaller, I may opt against the extra TP53, but I don't know. You might. I'm still tempted.
Do you not get in adulthood when you've already grown your organs?
Yeah, I guess that's true.
So, I mean, I think, trying to speed up evolution doesn't always, it may not go so well every time. So,
yeah.
All right. Well, while people are potentially working on that, there's got to be other things that you've learned, because you've already kind of blown our minds a bit about humpback whales and elephants and other large creatures. So, what else did you learn while you were researching this topic?
Yeah, I like to think that we went way into the weeds of the savannah and we are now coming out the other side. So there are two other fun facts that I could just not resist telling you guys about. The first is that rodents, and in particular the naked mole rat, which was very popular on a television show when I was a child, you may or may not be familiar with. But naked mole rats have very long lives and marked resistance to cancer. Like, it is case reportable to find naked mole rat cancer. And there are several proposed mechanisms involved. We're going to link to a review paper in the show notes. It totally blows whales out of the water on complexity. I thought both that it was maybe a little too complex to go through all the way, and also that why naked mole rats don't get cancer, it just didn't have the same ring for the episode.
Is the show Rugrats?
No, it's Kim Possible.
Okay, yeah.
Two, speaking of animals that have been on TV in animated shows, the highest rate of mammalian cancers by far is the Tasmanian devil. Had you guys heard of this?
No,
I had not. So if you look in, again, we'll link to the paper. So you can look, there's a graph. And like we talked about, most mammals, somewhere between 10 and 20% rates of cancer on these autopsies. In Tasmanian devils, it was about 50%.
oh my gosh.
Yeah. And I thought, oh my God, what is going on here? We have to look that up more. And unfortunately, it doesn't so much tell us about cancer predisposition as it does about cancer transmission. And so, unfortunately, in the Tasmanian devil population, there are a couple of cancer lineages. It's called facial tumor disease among the population of Tasmanian devils. It is not infectious, so it's not like a virally mediated cancer. It's a cancer line that is spread from facial tumors of Tasmanian devils biting each other. And so it's a literal transmissible cancer epidemic. And so at times that's affected the majority of the Tasmanian devil population. It tells us something else about cancer biology, but not quite as much. I thought it was going to be some like they don't have P53 or they miss some protein or something like that, which is not the case.
They're just biting each other's faces.
And transmitting cancer, which we normally don't think about.
Right.
Hannah, you've taken us on a tour de force of biology, of geography, history. I mean, we've been to multiple continents, eons of evolution, paradoxes. So thank you. This was such a fun episode. What are your take-home points?
I had so much fun with this one. Okay, so the first take-home point is that elephants have a lower rate of cancers than would be expected for their size and for their longevity. The second is that P53 is a tumor suppressor protein encoded by the TP53 gene, which helps promote apoptosis or pause the cell cycle in response to cell stress and DNA damage. Elephants have a high number of copies of P53 and isoforms, which have emerged as they increased in size evolutionarily. And people tend to think, or it's thought, that the high number of P53 isoforms likely is helping prevent elephants from getting cancer.
So cool. Crazy. Well, yes, good for them. Yes. Well, that wraps up another episode of the Curious Clinicians. Thank you, as always, for joining us. Claire Morgan of Notterly.com is our podcast audio editor, and Giancarlo Bonomo is a producer for the show. You can join our mailing list at CuriousClinicians.com to stay up to date on episode releases and have detailed notes delivered directly to your inbox. You can subscribe to our Substack at thecuriousclinicians.substack.com and check us out on YouTube at the Curious Clinicians Podcast. Physicians and other healthcare professionals can earn CME and MOC credits from VCU Health just for enjoying this episode. For more information, visit ce.vcuhealth.org/CuriousClinicians. And as always, the information contained in this episode is for educational and entertainment purposes only and does not constitute medical advice. Until next time, you've been the Curious Clinicians.